Agent Maya Collins had always been a force to reckon with. Standing tall in her crisp FBI suit, she carried an air of confidence that commanded respect. Her reputation preceded her. She was known as one of the sharpest minds in the Bureau, someone who could crack cases others deemed unsolvable. But today, Maya wasn't stepping into familiar territory. Today, she was leaving behind the bustling halls of the FBI headquarters and heading to a small town where tensions ran high and trust was hard to come by. The case itself was daunting. Organized crime had taken root in this sleepy little community, and it was spreading like wildfire. The local police department, overwhelmed and understaffed, had reached out for federal assistance. Enter Agent Maya Collins, intelligent, determined, and ready to take charge. However, what awaited her wasn't just a challenging investigation. It was a test of character. As Maya drove into the town, she couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The streets were eerily quiet, and the few people walking around gave her curious looks. Some nodded politely, others turned away quickly, avoiding eye contact altogether. It wasn't hostility exactly, but there was an unmistakable unease in the air. Maya reminded herself why she was here: to do her job, no matter the environment or circumstances. When she arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere inside matched the tension outside. The building looked outdated, its walls painted in dull beige, and the faint smell of coffee lingered everywhere. Officers moved about with hurried steps, some glancing briefly at Maya before returning to their work. She introduced herself to the sergeant on duty, who greeted her warmly enough but seemed distracted. "Officer Dawson will be your main point of contact," he said, gesturing toward a burly man leaning against a desk nearby. Maya extended her hand to greet him, already mentally preparing for the task ahead. Officer Greg Dawson barely glanced at her before offering a limp handshake. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise when he realized she was black. Maya noticed it immediately, but chose not to dwell on it. Instead, she launched into a brief overview of the case, outlining her plan and emphasizing the importance of collaboration between federal agents and local law enforcement. But as she spoke, she sensed resistance brewing. A couple of officers exchanged skeptical glances, while Dawson crossed his arms over his chest, clearly unimpressed. He interrupted her mid-sentence, questioning whether her big city tactics would even work in a place like this. Maya paused, meeting his gaze steadily. She knew moments like these were inevitable. They came with the territory of being a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. Yet, instead of letting frustration creep in, she smiled slightly and replied, "Let's find out together." Though her tone was calm, her words carried weight. For now, the room settled into an uneasy silence. Maya could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her focus. This was only day one, and she was determined to prove herself, not just as an agent, but as a leader who wouldn't back down, no matter the odds. Little did she know, this assignment would push her patience, resilience, and courage to their limits. The first encounter between Agent Maya Collins and Officer Greg Dawson was anything but smooth. As they gathered in a cramped conference room at the precinct, Maya opened her laptop and began laying out the details of the case. Her presentation was thorough. Maps, timelines, and suspect profiles filled the screen as she explained her strategy. She spoke with clarity and authority, making it clear that she was there to lead, not to follow. But Greg Dawson wasn't interested in listening. From the moment Maya started speaking, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression dripping with skepticism. He interrupted her repeatedly, questioning every decision she proposed. At first, his comments seemed pointed but professional, criticisms about big city agents who didn't understand how things worked in smaller towns. But as the meeting went on, his tone shifted, becoming sharper and more personal. "Seems like you've got all the answers," Greg said with a smirk, leaning forward slightly. "But I'm curious, Agent Collins, how much of this plan is actually yours? Or did someone else hand it to you?" Maya paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to Greg. His implication was clear. He was suggesting that Maya hadn't earned her position through skill or hard work. Instead of responding immediately, she took a deep breath and continued scrolling through her notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm, almost serene. "I assure you, Officer Dawson," she said evenly, "every part of this plan is based on careful analysis and experience. If you have specific concerns, I'd be happy to address them." Her composed response only seemed to irritate Greg further. He leaned back again, shaking his head dismissively. "Experience? Sure, but let's not forget where we are. This isn't some fancy office downtown. Out here, we deal with real people, real problems. Maybe you should stick to what you know best." The comment hung in the air, heavy with insinuation. A few officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others stared at their notebooks, avoiding eye contact altogether. Maya felt the weight of Greg's words, but she refused to let them rattle her. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to undermine her authority, to make her doubt herself in front of the team. And she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. Instead of rising to the bait, Maya smiled faintly and replied, "Then maybe you can teach me something, Officer Dawson. After all, collaboration is key if we're going to solve this case." Her voice was steady, almost friendly, but there was a steely edge beneath the surface. It was a subtle challenge, one that Greg clearly didn't expect. For a brief moment, Greg seemed caught off guard. Then, recovering quickly, he muttered something under his breath and shifted in his seat. The tension in the room was palpable, but Maya pressed on, redirecting the conversation back to the case. She outlined the next steps, assigning tasks to various members of the team, including Greg. Though he grumbled quietly, he didn't argue further, at least not in front of the group. As the meeting wrapped up, Maya packed up her materials, acutely aware of the eyes watching her. Some officers seemed sympathetic, offering small nods or murmurs of agreement when she passed by. Others kept their distance, unsure of which side to take. One young officer, however, lingered behind after the others had left. "You handled that well," he said softly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was listening. "Greg's difficult. Just be careful. He doesn't like being challenged, especially by someone like you." Maya raised an eyebrow, curious about the choice of words. "Someone like me?" she asked gently. The officer hesitated, then sighed. "You know what I mean. Look, I don't agree with how he acts, but he's got influence around here. Don't let him get under your skin." Maya nodded slowly, appreciating the warning but already steeling herself for whatever came next. She thanked the officer and walked out of the room, her mind racing. Greg Dawson might think he could intimidate her, but Maya had faced worse and come out stronger every time. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Maya's silence in the face of Greg Dawson's hostility spoke volumes. As the days passed, she continued to focus on the case, refusing to let his behavior distract her. Every time he made a snide comment or rolled his eyes during briefings, she responded with professionalism and calmness. Her lack of reaction seemed to frustrate him more than anything else. It was as if Maya had built an invisible wall around herself, one that Greg couldn't penetrate no matter how hard he tried. One morning, the team gathered for another strategy session. The room buzzed with quiet conversations until Maya entered, carrying files and maps under her arm. She set them down on the table and began outlining the day's objectives. Greg sat at the far end of the table, slouched in his chair, looking bored. When Maya mentioned assigning him to a surveillance detail, he scoffed loudly. "Surveillance? Seriously?" Greg said, leaning forward with exaggerated disbelief. "You think I don't have better things to do than sit in a car all day waiting for nothing to happen?" Maya didn't flinch. She looked directly at him, her expression neutral. "Actually, Officer Dawson, this is one of the most critical parts of the operation. We need someone experienced to monitor the suspect's movements without drawing attention. That's why I'm assigning you." Greg smirked, shaking his head. "Oh, so now you're trusting me with important work. Funny, I thought you'd just tell me what to do and expect me to follow orders like some rookie." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension rising. Maya, however, remained unfazed. She leaned slightly on the table, her voice steady but firm. "I trust your experience, Officer Dawson. But if you feel this assignment doesn't suit your skills, we can always discuss alternatives." Her tone was polite, almost inviting, but there was an unspoken challenge in her words. Greg opened his mouth to retort, then closed it again, realizing he'd walked into a corner. If he complained further, he'd look petty. If he backed down, he'd lose face. For a moment, the room was completely silent, everyone watching to see what Greg would do next. Finally, he muttered something under his breath and nodded curtly. "Fine. Whatever you say, Agent Collins." As the meeting continued, Maya noticed a subtle shift in the room's energy. Some officers exchanged impressed glances, while others scribbled notes, avoiding eye contact altogether. One officer even gave her a small smile when she passed by later, a gesture that felt like quiet support. Maya appreciated these moments, knowing they were signs that her approach was working. By staying composed and professional, she was slowly earning respect, even from those who had initially doubted her. Later that evening, as Maya reviewed the case files alone in the precinct's makeshift office, she reflected on the day's events. She knew Greg wouldn't stop pushing her buttons, but she also knew she couldn't afford to let him win. This wasn't just about pride. It was about proving that she belonged here, that her expertise mattered. And yet she couldn't deny the toll it was taking. Keeping her emotions in check required immense effort, especially when faced with such blatant disrespect. Just as she was closing her laptop, a soft knock came at the door. It was Officer Ramirez, the same young officer who had warned her earlier. He hesitated before stepping inside, closing the door gently behind him. "I wanted to check on you," he said quietly. "Greg's not going to make this easy for you. Are you holding up okay?" Maya smiled faintly, touched by his concern. "I'll be fine," she replied. "People like him, they thrive on reactions. If I give him what he wants, I'm letting him win. And I don't plan to do that." Ramirez nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Still, don't underestimate him. He's got ways of making life difficult for people he doesn't like. Just watch your back." Maya thanked him and watched as he left the room. Alone again, she exhaled slowly, allowing herself a brief moment of vulnerability. Then, squaring her shoulders, she reopened her laptop and dove back into the case. No matter what challenges lay ahead, Maya was determined to stay focused. After all, the best way to silence critics like Greg Dawson was through results. And she intended to deliver. The tension between Maya and Greg reached its boiling point during a high-stakes stakeout operation. The team had been monitoring a suspected drug drop-off location for hours, and the pressure was mounting. Maya had carefully planned every detail of the operation, ensuring that everyone knew their roles and responsibilities. But Greg, true to form, decided to go rogue. It started subtly. At first, he ignored Maya's instructions to maintain radio silence, muttering complaints into his mic about how pointless the whole thing was. Then, against direct orders, he moved his vehicle closer to the target area, drawing unnecessary attention. When Maya called him out over the radio, his response was dismissive. "Relax, Agent Collins," Greg snapped. "I know what I'm doing. You're too busy playing it safe to get real results." Maya clenched her jaw, but kept her voice calm. "Officer Dawson, return to your designated position immediately. Your actions are compromising the operation." But Greg didn't listen. Instead, he exited his car and approached the suspect on foot, attempting to intimidate him into confessing. The suspect, clearly spooked, bolted, forcing the rest of the team to scramble into action. What should have been a controlled surveillance mission turned chaotic in seconds, all because of Greg's reckless behavior. When the dust settled, the suspect had escaped, and the team returned to the precinct empty-handed. Maya called an emergency meeting to debrief, her frustration evident despite her composed demeanor. As the group filed into the room, Greg walked in last, wearing a smug grin as if daring anyone to challenge him. "Care to explain what happened out there, Officer Dawson?" Maya asked, her tone measured but firm. Greg shrugged nonchalantly. "What can I say? Things got heated. Sometimes you've got to take risks to get results." "Risks?" Maya repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Or blatant disregard for protocol. Your decision not only jeopardized the operation, but also put the entire team in danger." Greg's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, here we go again. The big-shot FBI agent thinks she knows everything. Tell me, Agent Collins, did you earn your badge through hard work, or was it handed to you because of some diversity quota?" The room fell deathly silent. Everyone froze, staring at Greg in disbelief. Even those who had sided with him before seemed shocked by the venom in his words. For a moment, no one spoke. All eyes turned to Maya, waiting for her reaction. Maya felt a surge of anger, but she pushed it down, refusing to let Greg provoke her. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, and locked eyes with him. "If my qualifications are such a mystery to you, Officer Dawson," she said evenly, "then perhaps you'd like to compare records. Or maybe you'd prefer to focus on solving this case instead of wasting time questioning mine." Her words landed like a punch. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time, he looked genuinely rattled, unsure of how to handle someone who refused to rise to his bait. Sensing the shift in power dynamics, Maya pressed on. "This isn't about me or you," she continued, addressing the entire room now. "It's about doing our jobs effectively. If any of you have issues with my leadership, I'm happy to discuss them privately. But when we're in the field, I expect full cooperation. Is that understood?" One by one, the officers nodded, some murmuring agreement. Greg remained silent, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and rage. He sank back into his chair, defeated, for now. As the meeting ended, Maya gathered her notes, her mind racing. She knew Greg wouldn't give up easily. In fact, she suspected this confrontation was far from over. But for the first time since arriving in the town, she sensed a crack in his armor. By staying calm and professional, she had exposed the hollowness of his attacks and earned the respect of her colleagues in the process. Walking out of the room, Maya allowed herself a small private smile. Greg might think he could break her, but she was just getting started. The fallout from Greg Dawson's outburst during the debriefing meeting rippled through the precinct like a storm. Word spread quickly among the officers, and whispers followed Maya wherever she went. Some were sympathetic, shaking their heads at Greg's behavior, while others remained cautious, unsure of whose side to take. But one thing was clear. Maya's composed response had left an impression. Even those who had doubted her began to see her in a different light. The next day, Maya arrived early at the precinct, determined to regain control of the investigation. She knew that letting Greg's antics derail the case wasn't an option, not when lives were at stake. As she reviewed the files in the makeshift office, Officer Ramirez knocked on the doorframe. "Got a minute?" he asked hesitantly. Maya gestured for him to come in. "Of course." Ramirez closed the door behind him and leaned against the wall, his expression uneasy. "Look, I know you're handling everything well, but Greg, he's not done with you. He's been talking to some of the guys, trying to turn them against you. Just thought you should know." Maya nodded, unsurprised. "Thank you for telling me. I appreciate it." "He's planning something," Ramirez added. "I don't know what, but he's mad. Really mad." Maya gave a small, tight smile. "Then I guess we'll deal with it when it happens." Her calmness seemed to unsettle Ramirez. "You're not worried?" "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't," Maya admitted. But worrying won't solve anything. What matters is staying focused on the case and making sure everyone else does too. Ramirez hesitated, then nodded. You're tougher than you look, Agent Collins. After he left, Maya returned to her work, but Ramirez's warning lingered in the back of her mind. She didn't have long to wait before Greg made his next move. Later that afternoon, the team gathered for another briefing. This time, Greg was conspicuously absent. When someone mentioned it, another officer shrugged. He said he had better things to do. The comment drew nervous laughter, but Maya ignored it. Instead, she dove straight into the plan, outlining the next phase of the operation. As she spoke, Greg stormed into the room, slamming the door behind him. His face was red, his jaw clenched. Without waiting for permission, he interrupted Maya mid-sentence. You think you're so smart, don't you? He barked, pointing a finger at her. Walking around here like you own the place, acting like you're better than us. Well, let me tell you something. Maya held up a hand, cutting him off. Her voice was soft but firm. Officer Dawson, if you have something to say it respectfully, or don't say it at all. Greg faltered for a moment, thrown off balance by her interruption. But he quickly recovered, sneering. Respect. You want respect. Maybe you should earn it instead of expecting it just because of your badge. The room tensed, but Maya didn't flinch. She stepped closer to Greg until they were standing face to face. Her voice remained steady, almost conversational. Prove me wrong, she said simply. The words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Greg blinked, clearly caught off guard. What? Prove me wrong. Maya repeated, her gaze unwavering. If you honestly believe I'm not qualified, then show me. Do your job better than I do mine. Follow protocol. Solve the case. Prove that you're the better investigator. For a moment, Greg looked lost, as though he hadn't anticipated this kind of challenge. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The room was silent, every eye fixed on the standoff. Finally, Greg muttered something under his breath and stormed out, slamming the door again. The tension broke, and the officers exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly. Maya turned back to the group, picking up where she'd left off as though nothing had happened. After the meeting, Officer Ramirez approached her once more. That was impressive, he said, grinning slightly. I've never seen anyone shut Greg down like that. Maya smiled faintly. Sometimes people need to be called out, not with anger, but with logic. Now, let's get back to work. As she walked away, Maya felt a renewed sense of determination. Greg might still try to undermine her, but she had planted a seed of doubt, not just in his mind, but in the minds of those watching. And that, she realized, might be enough to tip the scales in her favor. In the days that followed, Maya's leadership began to shine brighter than ever. Her ability to remain calm and focused under pressure earned her quiet admiration from many of the officers, even those who had initially doubted her. As the investigation progressed, she uncovered key pieces of evidence that brought them closer to cracking the case. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements all came together like puzzle pieces under her guidance. Greg Dawson, however, continued to struggle. His earlier attempts to sabotage the operation had left him isolated, both professionally and socially. Officers who once tolerated his behavior now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose actions repeatedly jeopardized the team. When Greg tried to insert himself into conversations or claim credit for breakthroughs, he was met with indifference, or worse, outright dismissal. One afternoon, Maya led a critical meeting to discuss new developments in the case. She presented a timeline connecting several suspects to recent criminal activities, pointing out patterns that no one else had noticed. The room buzzed with energy as officers exchanged ideas, building on her findings. For the first time since Maya arrived, there was a sense of unity, a shared determination to solve the case. Greg sat silently at the back of the room, arms crossed, his usual arrogance replaced by simmering frustration. He interrupted only once, attempting to question the validity of Maya's conclusions. But this time, instead of backing down, other officers spoke up in her defense. "Agent Collins has been spot on so far," said Officer Ramirez, glancing pointedly at Greg. "Her analysis checks out." Another officer chimed in, nodding. "Yeah, if we'd listened to her earlier, maybe we wouldn't have lost that suspect during the stakeout." Greg scowled but didn't argue further. It was clear that his credibility was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. By undermining Maya, he had inadvertently highlighted his own shortcomings. And as the team rallied around her, Greg found himself increasingly marginalized. Meanwhile, Maya pressed forward, leading raids and interrogations with precision. During one particularly tense interview with a key suspect, she demonstrated her skill by dismantling his alibi piece by piece. The suspect eventually cracked, revealing crucial information about the crime ring's hierarchy. When Maya returned to the precinct later that evening, the team greeted her with nods of approval, even a few congratulatory pats on the back. Word of her success reached higher-ups within the department, including the precinct captain. Impressed by her results, he pulled Maya aside after a briefing session. "You're doing excellent work here, Agent Collins," he said sincerely. "I know things haven't been easy, but you've handled yourself with professionalism. Keep it up." Maya thanked him, though she couldn't help noticing Greg lurking nearby, his expression darkening as he overheard the exchange. She knew he wouldn't give up without a fight, but for now, she felt a small measure of vindication. As the week drew to a close, Greg made one last desperate attempt to regain control. He approached the captain privately, accusing Maya of withholding evidence and misleading the team. But when the captain asked for specifics, Greg stumbled, unable to provide any concrete proof. Instead, his accusations sounded hollow and vindictive. The captain listened patiently before responding. "Officer Dawson, Agent Collins has delivered results where others, including you, have failed. If you have legitimate concerns, bring them forward. But baseless claims won't help anyone." Humiliated, Greg retreated, his face flushed with anger. Later that day, several officers avoided making eye contact with him altogether. Even his closest allies seemed reluctant to engage, sensing that siding with him would only reflect poorly on them. For Maya, the shift in dynamics was undeniable. While Greg's hostility remained a challenge, it no longer carried the same weight. She had proven herself not through arguments or retaliation, but through sheer competence and perseverance. With each passing day, the team grew stronger, and Greg became more irrelevant. As Maya reviewed the latest updates on the case late one night, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. This assignment had tested her patience, resilience, and courage in ways she hadn't anticipated. But it had also reaffirmed something important. True strength wasn't about fighting back. It was about rising above. And Maya was determined to keep rising, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. The investigation was reaching its climax, and tensions in the precinct were at an all-time high. Maya had pieced together enough evidence to identify the mastermind behind the organized crime ring, a local businessman named Victor Hale, who had been using his legitimate enterprises as a front for illegal activities. With a warrant secured, the team prepared for a coordinated raid on Hale's warehouse, where they believed critical documents and contraband were hidden. Greg Dawson, however, wasn't ready to let go of his vendetta. Sensing that this operation could cement Maya's reputation and further expose his own failures, he devised one final scheme to undermine her. Late one evening, while most of the team was wrapping up their shifts, Greg quietly altered a key piece of intel in the case file. He changed the location of the planned raid, feeding false coordinates into the system and ensuring that Maya would lead the team into a dead end. The next morning, Maya arrived early to review the details before heading out. She noticed something odd about the address listed in the updated report. It didn't match the patterns she'd observed in previous surveillance. Trusting her instincts, she cross-referenced the information with older files and quickly realized it had been tampered with. Her heart sank as she pieced together what had happened. Instead of confronting Greg immediately, Maya decided to turn the tables. She gathered undeniable proof of his sabotage by accessing the digital logs, which showed exactly when and where the changes had been made. Armed with this evidence, she requested an emergency meeting with the precinct captain and federal supervisors overseeing the case. When everyone assembled in the conference room, Maya laid out her findings calmly but firmly. Projecting the altered document onto the screen, she highlighted the discrepancies and traced them back to Greg's login credentials. The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. "This isn't just carelessness," Maya said, her voice steady. "This is deliberate interference with a federal investigation, an act that puts lives at risk and compromises our efforts to bring these criminals to justice." Greg, caught off guard by the sudden summons, looked pale as he entered the room. When confronted with the evidence, his initial reaction was denial. "That's ridiculous," he sputtered. "Someone must have hacked my account." But his excuses rang hollow, especially when Maya revealed additional details, including timestamps that aligned perfectly with his shift. Even the captain, who had tolerated Greg's behavior until now, seemed furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" the captain demanded, slamming his hand on the table. "You've jeopardized not only this case but the safety of your fellow officers." For the first time, Greg appeared truly shaken. His usual bravado crumbled under the weight of the accusations, and he stammered, unable to mount a coherent defense. As the meeting concluded, Greg was suspended pending an internal investigation, his career hanging by a thread. With Greg removed from the equation, the team moved forward with the correct plan. Under Maya's leadership, they executed the raid flawlessly, uncovering stacks of incriminating documents and seizing large quantities of illegal goods. Victor Hale was arrested shortly afterward, thanks to Maya's sharp instincts and meticulous preparation. As the dust settled, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted dramatically. Officers who had once doubted Maya now openly praised her dedication and skill. Even those who had stayed neutral couldn't deny the impact she'd made, not just on the case, but on the culture of the department itself. That evening, as Maya packed up her belongings, Officer Ramirez approached her with a grin. "You did it, Agent Collins. You took down the bad guys. And Greg, too." Maya chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I didn't do it alone. Everyone played a part." Ramirez nodded, then added sincerely, "Still, you handled everything with class. Most people wouldn't have kept their cool like you did." Maya smiled, reflecting on the journey. It hadn't been easy, but every challenge had pushed her to grow stronger. As she walked out of the precinct, the weight of the past weeks lifted slightly. She knew there would always be obstacles. People like Greg who tried to tear her down. But she also knew she had the strength to overcome them. And that realization made all the difference. The victory was sweet, but Maya Collins knew better than to let herself bask in it for too long. The arrest of Victor Hale and the dismantling of his criminal network marked a significant win, not just for her team, but for the entire community. Yet, as she stood outside the precinct on the final day of her assignment, watching officers load evidence into vans and debrief one another, Maya couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Exhaustion was the first. The week spent navigating hostility, proving herself, and staying laser-focused on the case had taken their toll. But beneath that fatigue was a quiet sense of pride. She had walked into a hostile environment, faced blatant prejudice, and emerged not only unbroken but triumphant. Her calm demeanor, strategic thinking, and unwavering professionalism had earned her respect from even the most skeptical corners of the department. As she prepared to leave, several officers approached her to say goodbye. Some offered handshakes, others gave heartfelt thanks. "You changed things around here," one of them said sincerely. "Not just with this case, but with how you handled everything." Maya smiled softly. "Change starts with all of us," she replied. "I'm just glad we could work together to make a difference." Even Captain Harris stopped by, extending his gratitude. Agent Collins, I won't lie. When you first arrived, I wasn't sure what to expect. But you've proven yourself 10 times over. We're lucky to have had you leading this case. Her response was humble. Thank you, Captain. It's been a challenging experience, but also a rewarding one. I hope this is just the beginning of stronger collaboration between federal and local law enforcement. When Greg Dawson's name inevitably came up later, Maya chose her words carefully. Greg made mistakes, yes, but he's not beyond redemption. If anything, this should serve as a wake-up call for him and for everyone else. Bias doesn't just hurt individuals. It weakens teams and undermines justice. Her perspective surprised some, but it resonated deeply with others. Maya understood that while holding people accountable was essential, so too was leaving room for growth. She didn't harbor resentment toward Greg. Instead, she saw his downfall as a lesson, a reminder of the importance of integrity and teamwork. On her drive back to FBI headquarters, Maya reflected on the journey. This assignment had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Facing open hostility from someone like Greg had forced her to dig deep, relying not just on her skills, but on her resilience and emotional intelligence. Each insult, each attempt to undermine her authority, had only strengthened her resolve. And now, looking back, she realized something profound. True strength wasn't about reacting to negativity. It was about rising above it. But Maya also knew the fight wasn't over. Discrimination and bias weren't confined to small-town precincts. They existed everywhere, often in subtler forms. As a black woman in law enforcement, she had always been aware of the extra hurdles she faced. What set her apart was her refusal to let those hurdles define her. Every challenge was an opportunity to prove doubters wrong, not through anger or retaliation, but through excellence. When she arrived at headquarters, her colleagues greeted her warmly, eager to hear about the case. Maya shared the highlights without dwelling on the personal struggles. Instead, she emphasized the teamwork, the breakthroughs, and the ultimate success. Her story inspired many, especially younger agents who looked up to her as a role model. That evening, alone in her apartment, Maya allowed herself a moment of reflection. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. For the first time in weeks, she felt at peace. The road ahead would still be difficult, but she was ready. After all, she had already shown herself, and the world, that no amount of prejudice or adversity could dim her light. And as she sipped her tea, Maya reminded herself of something important. The battle for equality and respect wasn't fought in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It was fought quietly, day by day, through persistence, courage, and the belief that actions truly did speak louder than words.